Imagine waking up to find that an entire city, home to thousands of people, has vanished from the map in less than 12 hours. The streets are silent, the power is out, and every single resident is gone. What force could erase a populated place so completely that even its name would become a ghost? This is the story of Pripyat, Ukraine, a Soviet-era city built in 1970 to house workers at the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant. For 16 years, it thrived as a model socialist town with schools, hospitals, an amusement park, and nearly 50,000 residents. Then, on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 exploded during a safety test, and within 36 hours, Pripyat ceased to exist as a living city. The evacuation remains one of the most sudden and total in human history. What makes this story urgent today is that Pripyat still stands, frozen in time, radioactive, and inaccessible, a monument to the invisible dangers of the atomic age and the cost of secrecy during crisis. On the night of April 25, 1986, engineers at Chernobyl's Reactor 4 began a routine safety test to see if the turbines could generate enough power during a shutdown to keep coolant pumps running. The test required reducing reactor power, but the operators accidentally dropped it too low. When they tried to increase power again, design flaws in the RBMK reactor caused an uncontrolled chain reaction. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, two massive explosions blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid into the air and ignited the graphite core. A plume of radioactive smoke, containing isotopes like cesium-137, strontium-90, and iodine-131, rose over a mile into the sky. Firefighters arrived within minutes, unaware they were being exposed to lethal doses of radiation. Many would die within weeks. For the next 36 hours, Soviet officials debated what to do. Pripyat was less than 2 miles from the burning reactor, but no evacuation order was given. Residents went about their daily routines. Children played outside, people went to work, couples prepared for a wedding scheduled that afternoon. Authorities measured radiation levels in the city that were already hundreds of times above safe limits, but the information was classified. On the morning of April 27th, the Politburo finally authorized a full evacuation. At 2 p.m., loudspeakers across Pripyat crackled to life with a calm, scripted announcement. Residents had 3 hours to pack a small bag and board buses for a temporary evacuation of 3 days. Mothers grabbed photographs. Fathers locked doors they would never reopen. By nightfall, 1,200 buses had carried 49,360 people away from the city. They never returned. Within days, the Soviet military sealed Pripyat inside a 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Soldiers shot abandoned pets to prevent them from spreading contamination. Helicopters dumped 5,000 tons of sand, lead, and boron onto the reactor to smother the fire. The city became a tomb. The explosion itself was confirmed by Swedish radiation monitors on April 28, 1986, 2 days after the disaster, when elevated levels of cesium-137 were detected over Scandinavia. Soviet officials initially denied any accident had occurred. Only after international pressure mounted did Moscow acknowledge the disaster on April 28 in a terse, 20-second television announcement. The scale of the evacuation is documented in Soviet transportation logs, which record the deployment of 1,200 buses, 300 trucks, and 3 trains to move the population of Pripyat and surrounding villages. Radiation readings taken by military dosimetrists in Pripyat on April 27 showed surface contamination levels between 10 and 1,000 roentgens per hour, enough to cause acute radiation sickness within minutes. Photographs and film shot by Soviet photographer Igor Kostin on April 26 show the exposed reactor core glowing red at night, with debris scattered across the plant grounds. These images were withheld from publication for years. Survivor testimony, collected in the 1990s by journalist Svetlana Alexievich, describes the confusion, the lack of information, and the eerie calm of officials who knew the danger but said nothing. Debate continues over whether the evacuation was delayed to avoid panic, or because officials underestimated the danger. Some historians argue that Soviet secrecy and bureaucratic paralysis made swift action impossible. Others suggest the delay was a calculated risk, believing radiation levels would drop overnight. Documents show that local officials requested evacuation within hours of the explosion, but approval from Moscow took a full day. The exact death toll remains contested. The official Soviet figure of 31 deaths counted only immediate victims, firefighters and plant workers who died from acute radiation syndrome within weeks. The World Health Organization estimated in 2005 that up to 4,000 people may eventually die from radiation-related cancers, though this figure is debated. Other studies, including a 2006 Greenpeace report, suggest the toll could exceed 90,000, though these higher estimates are not universally accepted by scientific bodies. There are also questions about what residents were told and when. Some survivors recall rumors of an explosion circulating on April 26, while others insist they heard nothing until the loudspeaker announcement. The Soviet government's insistence that the evacuation was temporary, telling people they would return in 3 days, has been interpreted both as a lie to prevent panic and as genuine uncertainty about the scope of contamination. For the people of Pripyat, April 27, 1986, was the last day of their ordinary lives. Families who had lived in the city for decades left with a single suitcase, expecting to return before the week was over. They did not. Children left behind toys, schools abandoned mid-lesson with textbooks open on desks, and hospitals evacuated patients in their beds. The psychological toll of sudden, permanent displacement, of losing not just a home but an entire city, has been described by survivors as a kind of collective grief with no closure. Many evacuees were resettled in hastily built housing in Kiev and other cities, where they faced stigma and fear from neighbors who believed they carried contamination. Marriages broke apart. Communities scattered. For years, survivors were prohibited from speaking publicly about their experiences. The secrecy compounded the trauma, turning invisible radiation into a metaphor for invisible suffering. The children of Pripyat faced unique consequences. Many were exposed to radioactive iodine-131, which concentrates in the thyroid gland. In the years after the disaster, rates of thyroid cancer in children across Ukraine and Belarus increased dramatically. Though most survived with treatment, the illness marked an entire generation with the physical legacy of a disaster they were too young to understand. To understand how a city vanishes overnight, you need to understand radiation. Unlike fire or flood, radiation is invisible, odorless, and tasteless. It announces itself only through the damage it does to living cells. Think of it like sunlight passing through glass. You don't see it, but your skin burns. The isotopes released from Reactor 4 will remain dangerous for decades. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years, meaning Pripyat won't be safe for full human habitation until the 22nd century. The disaster exposed a deeper failure than engineering. It revealed the cost of authoritarian secrecy during a crisis. Soviet officials prioritized political image over public safety, delaying warnings and suppressing data that could have saved lives. The evacuation of Pripyat was efficient once it began, but the 36-hour delay meant thousands received preventable radiation exposure. Pripyat also forces us to confront a question about technology and risk. Nuclear power promised clean, limitless energy, and the RBMK reactor was a point of Soviet pride. But the reactor's design had known flaws. A positive void coefficient that made it unstable at low power, and control rods that briefly increased reactivity when inserted. The disaster proved that even sophisticated technology, in the absence of transparency and safety culture, can fail catastrophically. Here's what we know for certain. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 exploded, releasing a massive plume of radioactive material. 36 hours later, Pripyat, a city of 50,000, was evacuated in under 5 hours and never repopulate. What remains uncertain is the full human cost, the extent of long-term health effects, and whether earlier action could have prevented the scale of the disaster. In the near term, Pripyat will remain a radioactive exclusion zone, accessible only through guided tours that began in the early 2000s. Radiation levels in the city center have dropped significantly, but hot spots near the reactor remain lethal. Confidence level high. Plans to entomb Reactor 4 in a permanent containment structure, called the New Safe Confinement, were completed in 2019 at a cost of over $2 billion. This massive steel arch is designed to last 100 years, buying time to develop technology for full decommissioning. Whether that technology will arrive on schedule is uncertain. Confidence level medium. There is ongoing debate about whether parts of the exclusion zone could one day be reclaimed for limited use, solar farms, research stations, or memorial sites. Some scientists argue that certain areas now have radiation levels comparable to natural background radiation in other parts of the world. Others warn that contaminated soil and groundwater will pose risks for centuries. Confidence level low. One scenario that haunts experts is the possibility of another accident at the site, structural failure of aging Soviet-era buildings, or a wildfire spreading radioactive particles. In 2020, forest fires came within miles of Pripyat, raising contamination levels temporarily. As climate change increases wildfire risk, this threat will grow. Pripyat is a city that will never be rebuilt, never repopulate, and never forgotten. It stands as a reminder that some human errors are irreversible, that the invisible can be deadly, and that silence in the face of disaster is its own kind of catastrophe. The story of how a city disappears overnight is also a story about how truth is buried, and what it costs when we uncover it too late. If you want to understand how governments respond when disaster strikes, watch our next video on another nuclear crisis where information was the first casualty. That video picks up where this one ends.